Thank you all so much for being here. I can't see you because the lights are so bright, but I can hear you, so I know you're out there. Let me also pay my respects to the Gadigal people. You know, Tracy, my great-great-grandfather lived here at Circular Quay back in the 1850s.
Wow.
Many of the Aboriginal people, he was a Dharawal man from around the La Perouse area, had been rounded up and they were living in the old boat sheds here. So whenever I'm here, I feel that presence very, very strongly. So I want to pay my respects. And please, again, welcome Tracy here as well. I thought about this today and I thought, gee, putting me in a room for an hour with a psychologist. Tracy, you might need two.
Absolutely.
To get through my issues. But seriously, I was reading this book and so much of it resonated with me. The personal journey that Tracy's been on, but also the issues, the mental health issues, the trauma, the identity questions that we all carry. And I want to go through that tonight. Ordinarily, when I do something like this, it would be like an interview and it would be detached and I'd go through the book and I'd ask Tracy questions. But I think this calls for something much more intimate than that and something much more real than that. So we are going to go to some places that are going to be hard for me and hard for you and hard for people in the audience as well, but things that are important. But I wanted to start and ask you, Tracy, if you wouldn't mind reading something from the book that means something to you. There's so much in this, of course, that is so important to your work. But if you would choose something that you wanted to read
definitely.
Before we begin the conversation.
Yeah, and thank you. And it's look, I just feel like I'm fangirling out madly here next to the incredible Stan Grant, and obviously, you know, I'd like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people and my traditional Nyamal people who have just protected me, and thousands and thousands of Indigenous people across this country I've had the privilege of working with as a psychologist. This story actually is probably a good place to start because it's the story of actually my mum, and what I find in life is that so much of where we end up comes down to luck. You know, the luck, and sometimes there's a sliding door moment that if this happened, you could have been in a completely different place. This story is so powerful, and it's powerful in lots of ways. It's powerful because my mum only started telling us this story a couple of years ago, and this is something that occurs when people have complex childhood trauma, that at the age at which things occur, it's very difficult for people to reconcile and often retrieve memories of things that have occurred. And quite often what happens is when they unpack this memory, Mum just kept ruminating over it again and again and again, it's almost like trying to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. So it's incredibly powerful. It's actually called Black Identity and a Father's Love, and it starts, it's actually in chapter 1. So Mavis Ball was a born and bred Nyamal woman from Marble Bar. She was the eldest of 4 children, the only girl. Her younger brothers, Harold, Eric and Les, were all over 6'4", and with Mum at 5'11", the same height as me, they were certainly a formidable family. She was born in Port Hedland in 1942 to Kitty and Murphy Ball. My maternal grandparents were highly respected in their hometown of Marble Bar, more than 180 kilometres south of Port Hedland. Murphy and Kitty had been traditionally married by permission of the Chief Protector. In this generation of the government policy of protectionism, written approval from the Chief Protector was required for almost everything, from buying a pair of socks to getting married. It was an era of complete and utter control over the lives of Aboriginal people, the basis of which continues in much government policy today in its race-based restrictions of human rights. Murphy was a taxi and truck driver, an extremely well-to-do occupation for a full-blood, according to the potted history that we as a family have only recently managed to glean from his native welfare files. Murphy and Kitty were hard-working, and they modelled this for Mum and her 3 younger siblings. They worked hard because they wanted a better life for their kids, and they would die trying. Their efforts were, unknown to Mum, fuelled by a fear that the welfare would come calling for their children. Having greater opportunities, though, was also the false promise of the policy of protectionism, that if you behaved, if you conducted yourself like a white person, you would be afforded more rights. These rights not only never came, but required denying who you were, your culture, and all who continued to practice it, that being your own family. As children, we fundamentally develop a sense of self based on our worlds being safe and predictable, and on being told that we are loved and lovable. It is still caregiver responsiveness to children that consistently provides this critical early safe haven to develop secure attachment. But when parents are also powerless to stop traumatic events from occurring, how do children grow up with a sense of safety, a sense of security? Complicating this further was the fact that this racial trauma, it was racial trauma and it was perpetuated on Aboriginal people by government legislation, and the abuse was then enabled and perpetuated by systems and individuals. So if the systems that are there to protect are also the abuser, the question is, who do you go to for safety? Homes in which complex racial trauma is evident means that environments are modelled as unsafe by those around us. Love can feel overwhelming because there is a fear and anxiety attached to it. Sigmund Freud referred to this as a reaction formation, a defence mechanism against fear of stress. That being, if I truly attach to a child who could be ripped away from me at any time, that would be intolerable. It's therefore better to not show love or affection because this will protect me from the pain of loss. In these complex circumstances, our biology is altered as our nervous system becomes armed to remain activated in anticipation of threat of loss. Love feels threatening because it's been associated with fear and loss. I see this in so many of my clients, and we'll delve into this in my reading on The Man Who Couldn't Love later. For individuals who've experienced abuse, reconciling it takes energy and insight. It can also not occur when trauma is continuing in their environment. The trauma of child removals is that they are as unpredictable as they were unstoppable. It's taken a lifetime for Mum to share the pain and trauma of her early life, and even now, it's only in small pieces. There are layers to my mum that she has never shared and never will, and I don't blame her. Looking back now as an adult, I am in awe of her strength and her resilience. When Mum was 9 years old, the welfare came calling. She remembers little of what happened next, other than being put on a small plane with two people she didn't know. They had told her parents that she was unwell and had to be taken to Port Hedland, but she was not unwell and she didn't understand why her parents had been told this. She remembers sitting on this plane and seeing her mum outside crying and being held up by her aunties. As the plane took off, her mum fell to the ground. Aunties grabbed rocks from the ground to hit themselves with. This is sorry cutting, Mum thought. It happens in times of death. Mum saw this during sorry time, but why are they doing this now? She began to cry. As the image of her mum became smaller and smaller in the plane's little window, she didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if she would ever see her family again. Her next memory is of being in a dorm and seeing two white people pacing nervously. As she watched them, her eyelids became heavy, her face numb from the tears, and she slowly drifted off to sleep. "Mavis, wake up," whispered a voice she recognised as strong arms wrapped around her in the dark to pick her up. "Shh." The light from the hallway illuminated her dad, Murphy's face. Was this a dream? She felt a familiar kiss on her forehead and a hug she had known so many times when she'd fallen asleep around the campfire, and her dad's strong, loving arms had carried her to bed, and she knew this wasn't a dream. Murphy Ball had found his way from Marble Bar to Port Hedland, all 187 kilometres through mud and mangrove trees to bring his daughter home. He then put her on his back and carried her all the way home, back through the mud, the mangroves and the oppressive heat. It sickens me how close my mum came to forced removal. Murphy Ball single-handedly changed the course of all of our lives. Love comes in many forms. It comes in hugs, it comes in I love yous, but it mostly comes in actions. The actions of a father's love has generationally saved us all.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. And thank you for talking about something that often we don't get to talk about as Aboriginal people, and that is love.
Yes.
And the love that sustains us. We hear, and we will hear so much about trauma and the impact of our history and the impact of institutions and racism, but love is what sustains us. And at the heart of your book, right at the start of your book, is a love story of Mavis and Mick,
absolutely,
your parents. Tell us how that came to be, how that relationship, how they found each other.
Yeah.
One parked outside the pub and one working inside the pub.
Now, Stan, it depends on who you believe, which side of the story you hear it from, right? So Mum's version of the story is that Mum was working in a pub and she had to go to work quite young to support her family, being the oldest and an Aboriginal woman, and she was working in the Port Hedland pub, which was a fairly well-to-do job, and Dad was so as we say in Western Australia, in love, like he fell in love. This is my woman, I love her. And Dad just adored her from the moment he set eyes on her. And Dad was from a very, disenfranchised background himself, found salvation in Aboriginal people, which is very common, I find, with non-Indigenous people, and Mum would say that she'd finish work and all of a sudden these lights would go on in the car and he'd follow her home to make sure she was safe, right? And which it sounds all very romantic, but I think they call that stalking, Dad. Just saying.
But this has a good end.
That's exactly right. But yeah, and they ended up, just the love story that they had. Two scallywags came good, hey, and they came from backgrounds that didn't have the strength of family. And the thing that is always, I guess I'm in awe with people that don't come from that sense of cohesion in families is how do they find a way, how do they still manage to develop families and so much love around them despite it, right? And my dad was one of those people that he would hug you so much you'd almost lose, circulation in your body. So he had that amazing ability to love that, that mum probably didn't have as much,
I love that story because there's so much in that. And apart from the love and the humour, is the way that we meet each other. And we still live in a society where we are defined so stringently by race and we're put into categories of race. And yet what you're talking about there is something so fundamentally human and humorous too.
Yeah.
My grandmother, my mum's mum, was white, and it sounds the same sort of story. She got locked out of home. her mother had kicked her out of home when she was about 15. She thought she'd become a nun, and she went to the convent, and she'd never set foot in the church in her life. And they asked her where she was born. She said, in Bethlehem. Where were you baptised? Down the River Jordan. The convent knew, it wasn't for her. Yeah. But there was an Aboriginal bloke. My grandfather lived down by the river, and he used to whistle at her whenever she passed by. So she thought, I've got nowhere to go. I'll move in with him. And she stayed for the next 30 years and had 13 children. But what's amazing about that, Tracy, is that often it is said to people like Tracy and I, oh, but you've got white blood in you, you're not really Aboriginal.
Yeah.
What you're describing there is the love of our communities that open their arms to people who sometimes have been disenfranchised, turned away from their own societies, and how they become part of our society. How did your dad become part of an Aboriginal society so there was no paradox in your identity? He was part of your identity, part of your community. To be black and white informs your Aboriginal identity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I put it this way in the book that when Aboriginal, it's very common that white people who are quite disenfranchised find salvation in Aboriginal people because when you've spent your entire life being judged by others, you don't judge others. And so that's what Dad found, that salvation there. And so Dad basically turned up in Port Hedland with everything that he owned in the back of his ute, right? And so parked on the side of the road. And so Aboriginal people literally just became his family and his safe haven. But for us, it was never Aboriginal or white, it was both. Right? So do you know what I mean? There's no choice here.
We never talked about it. No one said, oh, you're white. This was a family. It is a family, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, and that sense of self and sense of identity is something that for some of us we're very lucky that we reconciled earlier than others. But for me as a psychologist, I'll say this, that probably 99% of the suicides I respond to have identity conflicts implicated in them. So people are struggling with, am I Aboriginal? Do I fit in a mainstream white fellow world? Where do I fit? There's this, we call it culture stress. But
I want to come to that. I just want to stay with the relationship because while there is that love and there is that relationship and there is that family, the world saw them differently.
Yeah.
And Australia saw people differently. And for your mum, before she could even get married, she had to become a
citizen of her own country.
Describe that and what was required and what is the trauma of that as well in having to disavow what you are to become recognised as something else.
Yeah, there's so many layers to this whole conversation because we didn't actually find out about this until we're sort of in our 20s, right? So we're sort of going through mum's drawers as you do, looking for stuff in mum's. Just go through your mum's drawers. I know
your mum's here tonight. Be careful.
Just say someone called Tracy did this, right? Should we call her Tracy, right? So we come across this thing and it literally looked like a passport stand and we were kind of, what on earth is this? And Mum had ripped it because it was essentially said the native whose picture was affixed here is afforded all the rights of a citizen of Australia. Now, of course, we grew up in an environment where you'd probably call my mum fierce these days, right? So I watched this black woman in a racist white mining town, and that's the only way you could describe it. We're the only Aboriginal family in town. And I watched Mum take on racism in a way that took my breath away, right? So she never took a backward step on racism. And I watched that my whole life. So how do you explain to your kids, who you're raising to be strong, black and proud, that you went to Port Hedland Court and renounced your culture and that meant severing ties with your family and all those sorts of things? How do you explain to your children that you did that? And it doesn't surprise me that mum, literally buried it, right? Buried it metaphorically as well as psychologically and all those things. But the promises of the eras of that era was that if you do this, your children will be given better opportunities than what you had. And what's your job as a parent? Your job is for your children to struggle less than what you struggled. So it's absolutely understandable that mum did what she did.
When you found that, how did you feel, and what, if anything, did you ask your mother?
It's kind of, I guess by the time we found out, I was already, I think I was one of those born activists, right? So I was always really interested in it. So I'd done my own exploration and history. But to be honest with you, I felt almost a sense of relief, because there's so much denial in this country of our history, right? And a history denied is compelled to repeat itself. And so I'd hear all this stuff about, people not understanding why we have the overrepresentation of things that we do. And so to have this actual historical thing that you couldn't refute, it really happened. But in saying that also, Stan, people would actually also say to mum, that didn't happen, right? They'd actually see the actual thing and still say that didn't happen, And so that's the deep-seated denial. So for us, to be honest with you, we said, Mum, we can't forget this. And my brother actually has got it framed, and he's actually got it, set there, because there's so many layers to it. One is that we never need to forget, and the other thing that we need to feel bloody grateful. Because of the sorts of things my mum was prepared to sacrifice in order for us kids to have a better life than what she had,
And that better life leads you to university, and you describe waiting for that exam result, waiting for that to see whether you got the mark to go to university, which you did. But I love this, because when I read this, I had to smile to myself, because Tracy turns up at university. She'd never been on a bus. She'd never been up an escalator. And here she is at this and I thought, my God, I remember when I went to university the first time, and I turned up at the University of New South Wales, staying at Goldstein College. I had, apart from my grandmother, who I never really thought of as white anyway, I'd never eaten at a white person's table. I didn't know how they spoke, the things they laughed about. I went to the dining hall and I was terrified. For the first 6 months, I would wait for everyone else to go to dinner, race out of my room, run down the street, buy some takeaway food, run back, close the door and eat it, and hopefully no one ever saw me. But it is a culture shock.
It is.
And how did you deal with that? You've earned the right to be there, you've worked hard, but then you go, where am I?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Not very well is the answer. I decided I wanted to be a psychologist at 15, and so for me it felt like my entire life I wanted to be a psychologist, and I had to fight for an education, as we both have. And education, I had literally fight, and I couldn't believe I was at the University of Western Australia. And then I go into lecture theatres, and it was expecting to learn all this amazing stuff. And essentially, the word Aboriginal was not mentioned once in the first 3 years of my degree, right? So, and then I'd go and sit in lecture theatres, and all the other students had to do was just learn everything off by heart and then go and blitz the exams. For me, I had to learn it and then try and translate it in a way that would fit for Aboriginal people with nothing to guide me, right? And so it was just, I remember watching people and going, God, that must be so easy just to learn the subject matter. And that's all you have to do.
Because they do know the language.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And their parents have been, or grandparents have been, and they know the language. So how did you deal with that? What was the process and first of all, being able to stick it out, because we know it is so easy for people to just walk away from it.
Anyone can quit, I say to my students. And I said, you're here because you chose not to, right? So, but I quit. Do what I say, not as I do.
Yes. But you didn't quit.
I didn't quit. So actually, look, I felt that I had it wrong. I thought that I wasn't smart, I wasn't sophisticated, I was none of those sorts of things, because I would literally go, I was self-taught, Stan. I had distance education that I did was very different to school of the year. So school of the year, you have a classroom. Distance education was that you get your homework, you get your classes stuff sent to you. You'd do it by yourself and post it back to Perth. So I saw my teacher twice in 2 years, in year 11 and 12. And then they just allocated 3 free time during, school to basically... So I've been self-taught. So there were things such as do a bibliography. I didn't even know what a bibliography was, Stan. Like I literally had to look up what a bibliography was, and then I'd go to the library and I'd walk around the library and I couldn't find anything. So I'd walk around the library and then walk back to St Catherine's College, right, with nothing in my hands because I just did not know how to navigate a library. I'd never been in a library before. So to be honest with you, I thought that it was me. I thought that I wasn't smart enough. I thought all these things, and so I ended up getting my 3-year degree. That was good, and that was pretty big deal for someone from where I came from. And I ended up going out to the Western Desert and just working as a child protection worker. So that was when I've done 3 years, I'll just do, that's enough. And so to be honest, I didn't expect to go any further than that. Yeah.
Why psychology? And it's interesting with psychology too, because psychology in many ways, well, we know it's a 20th century science. It is something that's born out of the crisis of modernity, the dislocation, the loss of identity, the loss of connection, the rapid change in societies. And then you're taking something like that and applying it to people who are not born of that, but have experienced the rupture of that. Why psychology? What did you see in that you thought you may be able to bring?
It's the easiest answer I can give you tonight, probably, and that's because psychology prides itself on being the scientist practitioner model. The science informs the practice. So for me, when you've got children as young as 10 who are ending their life in this country, the stakes are too high for ambiguity. The stakes are too high to get it wrong. And so the only way we can have any opportunity of traction is for the science to actually show people what actually works, right? But it's a really challenging question. How do you make culture scientific, right? So I would find that people would have... There's too much ambiguity. People didn't know how to work with a depressed Aboriginal client. People didn't know how to work with trauma with Aboriginal clients. People didn't know how to do a suicide risk assessment. We are fundamentally failing at that really basic level to skill practitioners up, and we're failing our most vulnerable communities here because the science has been predicated on cultural exclusion, right? So it was obvious to me that psychology has a greater responsibility because different professions like nurses are patient advocates, that they have different, psychologist puts its hat on the idea that we're a scientist practitioner. But if you've excluded entire cultures from the science, then you're not actually doing your job, and I'll challenge that until my dying breath.
And how much of this too, in studying that, was confronting yourself and the things you shared with us tonight, your family's history, your own identity issues. And as you say, sadly, in so many of the suicides, there is some form of identity rupture, identity crisis at the heart of that. How confronting was it for you in what you were studying and learning about yourself?
Yeah, I think there's that thing that, the hardest person to get to know is yourself, right? And I think as psychologists, they used to do this thing where they used to make psychologists do therapy before they became psychologists. I think they need to get back to that. Right? But I try and keep this G-rated, but one of my supervisors when I did my registration, he said, Tracy, you've got to deal with your own shit first. And it's so true, and what we call that in psychology is transference, right? So there's this thing around, okay, if you have someone who has died by suicide in your family, can you work with suicidal people? If you're from stolen generations, can you work with stolen generations? For me, I had to be okay with my blackness, right? I had to be good with my blackness. So people come to you because of strength, right? People come to you because you have a robust sense of cultural identity. So for me, the reconciling of my identity was probably the hardest work I had to do.
Was there something to be reconciled?
Yeah, look, I was a really white kid, and they used to call me the Milky Bar kid. So, I've got a black mum, and I had literally, my hair was like that, like white. Right? So I didn't stand out at all, didn't stand out at all, right? And so there was that, right? And people, one of my favourite yarns that didn't actually make the book, and I wish it did, is that Aboriginal community mob, I was going up to a place called Wiradjuri and just out of Queensland, and this lady went to my workshop and she goes, oh my God, she's awesome, like this, and she was trying to convince the mob to come. And she said, oh, I love this. She goes, now, I'll just warn you, when you see her, you'll go... white, blonde, all the rest of it. And she goes, but when she opens her mouth, you'll completely get it. And I love that story, because it's just like, I don't look like the stereotypical.
But that does go to that dissonance between who you are, how other people see you, what a society sees. And, you talk a lot about this in the book, but one of the things that really spoke to me, and, you talk about kids who have told you, Aboriginal kids have told you stories of trying to rub the black off their skin. This is the collateral damage of racism. Our children. Now, my mum, I've still got memories of this. My mum walking into a bath and asked me what I was doing, and I was rubbing my skin red raw, because the very first memory I have of school was sitting down on the floor. The teacher was in front of us reading a story, and a little boy, and he did look like the Milky Bar Kid, and he put his arm next to mine and he said, "Why are you so black?" And, I come from an Aboriginal family, mum, dad, all my cousins. I'd never thought about that. But here I was in a room full of other people who were white, and there was so much in that question. It wasn't just that he was asking me, why is my skin a different colour? He never had to ask himself why he was so white. That was not in question. He had the power and the right to ask me that question. And to this day, there is no answer to that, because the moment you seek to answer it, you are trapped in the logic of it.
Absolutely.
This question of identity and racism that goes to the core of this. And this is something, as you tease out, it is still being experienced today.
Yeah, it is. And I think probably the chapter that I struggle with the most, and we talked about this earlier, was the chapter on identity. And because the concepts are quite they're original concepts, because basically I've seen this in a lot of my clients. So I've had to try and figure out this thing called black identity formation, right? So what you've described just there is essentially what happens is kids, when they develop, it's about 4 to 8 years of age, they start to develop this ability to pick up on difference for the first time. And so what they pick up on gender difference. That's the first thing they pick up on. They see the different bits, right? You're a boy and I'm a girl. Show you yours and I'll show you mine. That's okay between 4 to 8, but if you're still doing that at 35, that's not okay. That's not okay. Just saying. Sydney might be different to Western Australia. We don't know that yet. So they pick up on difference, and it's a very childlike difference. So what children do is they react to difference, and so then they see colour difference and they go, "Oh, you're black and I'm white." And so essentially what they do is they stress react to difference. And so because they can't make sense of it at a brain level, at a cognitive level, they fold away into a part of their brain where a stress reaction remains, and it's just all they're doing is reacting to difference. So essentially how racism develops is that you go through life unconsciously reacting to difference, right? And then these things called templates are formed, which means black feels stressful and white, because it feels the same, doesn't feel stressful, right? And so that's essentially what happens at a brain level. Now, the reason why this is really powerful stuff is because people with way too much time in their hands have discovered this, that they literally put probes on the brains of kids, and the emotional centre of your brain is called the amygdala. And what they actually do is...
fight or flight mechanism.
Exactly, and what they're showing is that kids' reactivity to blackness really peaks around 4 to 8, right? And the other side of the coin then is for black kids, we go through a period in which there'll be a rejection of your blackness, right? The sense of shame, the sense of all those sorts of things. This is something that we need to have a conversation about. This is something we need to talk about, because I see a lot of clients who have rejected their sense of culture. Now, I'm going to give you an example. Aboriginal kid removed from family, raised with a white family. Just say this is my stereotypical client. The kid wants to fit in, because when you're a kid, you want to fit in. You don't want to stand out for any perceived negative reason. So the kid starts to say things like, I don't want to go back to my black family because they're drunk and they're smelly and they're this. And so they're bought into the bullshit. And then welfare will respond by saying, oh, don't make them go back. My answer is, well done. You've just made something temporary permanent, right? There is a reconciling of. And so what happens is blackness is being perceived as threatening even to black kids, right? So you can actually have people that are stuck in stage 1 of black identity formation that I call you turn on your own people, so you can become quite racist towards your own. It's like you can't beat them, so join them. I don't want to be one of them type thing.
And then you can also live in this place where you have to fit in there and then go back home again. I mean, throughout school, if there were a lot of other Aboriginal kids around, it was safe ground. But we were also always being told that we were stupid. And when I was 14 years old, myself and other Aboriginal boys were called up to the principal's office, and I can still picture the day. And he said to us, "You will amount to nothing."
Yeah.
To nothing.
Yeah.
Luckily, I moved. Some of the other boys didn't, and they did leave school, and some of them are not with us today.
Yeah.
I moved to Canberra, and on the very first day, when I walked into class, written on the blackboard was, and excuse the language, "Be kind to Stan, Abos need love too." It is so hard. And then I'd go home, and at home, we're an Aboriginal family. We're embraced in that. We listen to country music, we tell jokes, we do all those things that blackfellas do.
Yeah.
And then I would go back out into this world. And I remember one day, Dad came to pick me up from school. There was only myself and my sister were the only Aboriginal kids in that school in Canberra. And my dad was standing there. He was a sawmiller. He was wearing his overalls, and he's a black man. And someone said, "Is that your father?" And I said, "Yeah." And the kids turned to each other and laughed.
Yeah.
And these... And I say this only in trying to say to people, it is so... And yet you and I would be judged today, and we are judged, and people say, "Oh, that's all right for them. They've succeeded. They're wonderful. They've been to universities. They're not really black at all."
Yeah.
This constant having to negotiate hostile spaces, hold on to who you are, carrying the weight of the trauma that you've been through, to just stay afloat, to just get through, is just so often so torturous, so overwhelming.
Yeah.
And it's still happening.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I think so much of that's probably why, I have the privilege of doing what I do every day, because the psychologist's job ultimately is to normalise and validate, right? And so even giving something a name, so when I talk to my Indigenous clients about, that sense of rejection of culture and that it's a phase that people go through, I have grown people who, in my workshops just crying and just heaving and all those sorts of things, because, you think about those experiences you had as a kid, Stan, and there's sorts of things that are really hard to talk about, the rejection of culture. And same thing, I had a black mum, and you have these horrible, social studies lessons that we used to have teaching Aboriginal people are savages and this and this and this. And of course I'm a white kid going, I don't want to be one of them. And then I'd have a black mum, and I was embarrassed of having a black mum. Now that's been really hard for me to actually admit things like that as it is for you. There's a lot of shame in being a victim, right? There's a lot of shame in being a victim, and that's what perpetrators rely on, to keep victims silent. And so what we actually need to do then is just normalise it and say, yes, we all go through this as Aboriginal people. And then people don't feel as if their experiences are, they feel as if they can't reconcile it. So if there's a normalising of it from other Aboriginal people, reconciling black identity is really hard, and it's a massive challenge. But we need to not shy away from it as psychologists and as therapists.
And in a society that is still sceptical or even hostile to the expression of Aboriginal identity.
Yeah, because people have... There's a really interesting thing in Australia that we're the only culture in Australia where people feel really emboldened to question our identity, right?
Yes.
I think I might have even put this in the book, but if someone says to me, I'm Italian, I go, cool, right? If I say I'm Aboriginal, they go, yes, but how Aboriginal are you?
You used to say your little finger.
My little finger's Aboriginal, my foot's Aboriginal, right? And exactly.
How ridiculous.
What's going on
How
with that?
ridiculous.
But why do people feel so... They have this right to actually question your Aboriginality, and no other culture has that, right? And it's basically the same old bag of tricks that colonialists used since time began, which was the proof of Aboriginality, which is now we're doing the proof of Aboriginality thing, where blackfellas are turning on each other, you're not a real Aboriginal, all that sort of stuff. But essentially what happens is my mum's certificate of citizenship started that, right? Where people would go, oh, you think you're too good for us, now you've got that certificate of citizenship. So colonialists will turn black people on each other. And if we turn them on each other, they'll do our jobs for us. And so now we're still continuing that with this proof of Aboriginality, where people are questioning and being emboldened around questioning identity. And what I see in my clients is that most of them are struggling with identity because of how the public perceives it, right? That they feel as if they can't explore their cultural identity because of fear of, all these sorts of things, because some become so weaponised, It's
And then there is the other thing you talk a lot about in here is also the issue of the collective idea of trauma.
Yeah.
The way I grew up and the family that I grew up in, it put me on a journey. I wanted to know. I wanted to know what put us here, what created this world, why did we experience this, and part of my journalism was going around the world, going to the worst places in the world. I reported war for 20 years. Trying to answer that question. Why are we capable of doing the worst to each other? And in the end, I had a complete breakdown.
Yeah.
And you describe so much of this in the book. I remember calling my wife. I was actually in Mongolia, and it was a good story compared to the places I'd been. And that's where it hit me for some reason. And I rang her, and the only thing I could say over and over was, through my tears, why did they do this to us? To carry that. How do you explain the idea, the concept, the reality of a collective and inherited trauma? Because people often say, it's history, get over it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all in the past. But what's the difference between a history that you can see as being all in the past or a history that you carry in your bones?
Yeah, and it's really interesting. So identity is something that people often have an external sense of so we look at internal sense of identity as well as external. So an external one would be judging you based on the colour of your skin. You're highly educated, so you're not a real Aboriginal anymore, right? So there's that external concept of what an Aboriginal should look like, be like, think like, and act like. Now, external stuff is outside of your control. So with my clients, I do a lot of work in terms of internal sense of cultural identity, and I describe that in the chapter. But essentially what that actually means is we treat cultural identity, which sounds really odd, but what we know is that people that have a strong, robust sense of cultural identity aren't our clients, right? So this is really original stuff in terms of you can't fix the external stuff that causes all the suicides and all the trauma. You cannot do that. And as a person, if everything in terms of how you can be, act and feel and everything that makes your life the way it should be is about everything out here, that's helpless and hopeless and powerless, right? So a good example is racism accounts for something like 30% of depression, probably most of the suicides I respond to. You can't fix racism. You're not going to get rid of racism. So what's left? What's left is, well, we're kind of interested in what separates the Aboriginal person who becomes your client from the Aboriginal person who doesn't. And what we find is that the people who don't become our statistic are the ones that have a really strong, robust sense of cultural identity. And so the research that I've done is really around that. It's actually figuring out what are the sorts of things that we can actually do to actually get people to a phase where you can actually reconcile cultural identity and treat cultural identity. And it sounds weird, Stan, because it's like, what do you mean you treat cultural identity? But it's critical because if we don't develop in people realistically the skills and coping mechanisms to cope with racism and cope with discrimination, to cope with all these sorts of things, then unfortunately that's reality for Aboriginal kids. They're going to experience racism, they're going to have all these sorts of experiences. So black parenting is very different to white parenting, for example, right? But yeah, I mean, the thing I think that's the most distressing is that there is that stuff. I talk a lot about racial trauma as a thing as well, which is something that's actually, again, a fairly original concept that people know about post-traumatic stress disorder. So you're exposed to a life-threatening event, and obviously there's a post-traumatic stress reaction to that. Then you've got complex post-traumatic stress disorder where you've got multiple layers of trauma. That's often childhood trauma. I'm actually arguing that racial trauma should be a separate category of trauma. And the reason why is because it's inescapable and enduring.
And it is you've spoken about issues of anger that you've had to deal with, and I know in myself, I'm constantly working on these things. I spend a lot of time back on country, and that's really important. Yeah, it is. That is just fundamental. But if someone cuts me off in the traffic, it's 200 years worth of history. Yeah, it is. Ask my wife. It's not just someone's cut me off in the traffic, it's And you know, look, it's not. It's, you know, we can laugh. But it's not good for me.
No,
So I have to find a way to deal with the anger. And one of the things that you say in here, Tracy, is trauma keeps you trapped in the past, looking backwards rather than forwards. I have done so much work around how we live with our history, and you know, I don't trust myself around history either.
Yeah.
Talking about history is like holding broken glass.
Yeah, it triggers you.
It triggers me. It often brings out the worst in me, and I've had to do a lot of work around what do I do with history. It's not a case of just saying it's something we can forget because we live it.
Yeah.
Every time I go home, I was back home with Mum and Dad on the weekend, and Mum has the same conversation with me every single time, and she always brings out photographs and she puts them in front of me and she tells me the stories about what happened to her dad and what happened to her younger brothers and sisters, and it's her way of saying, don't let this go.
Yeah.
This happened. It happened.
Yeah.
And she has to keep saying it happened. But I also have to find a way to live with it.
Absolutely.
So how do we live with that past that won't let us go, and we don't want to let go, but we have to find a way to live healthily with it?
Yeah, and absolutely. You need to always remember our past and our history, because, I mean, everything in terms of my history is who I am, everything in terms of your history is who you are. And it defines our personalities, how we parent kids, all those sorts of things. I think I talk a lot in the book around, look, you know, I don't believe in talk therapy. This is a really interesting thing, hey, that I've actually had, this is quite an interesting thing, that I literally stalk the highest profile traumatised clients in this country. Right, I literally do. I see something in the paper, something horrific that's happened, and I'll contact them through LinkedIn or whatever and say, I want to be your psychologist. And they're like, what the hell? Like this. And Stan, the reason why I do it is because good luck finding a psychologist to see you, right? When you've got the layers of trauma that Aboriginal people have, right, and the fact that we've normalised our trauma, right, then you've got the average psychologist who, frankly, just would fall apart at the seams with, you know, I'm talking about people who have, you know, had children suicide and had to, you know, find the bodies of their children, right? I've talked about, you know, the people who've had vigilante attacks where their children have been murdered, you know, just horrific things. And so the longest client I've ever had has been 9 months. And that was someone who had multiple deaths in her family and trauma. And the reason why is because I have to hit a goal in every single session. Right, I don't believe in people talking about their trauma. And I've developed this concept, and it's basically called the trauma triad. And so essentially I hit up 3 bits. And the first bit is really your thoughts. Okay, so your thoughts will trigger flight, fight, activation, those sorts of things. And so I give people really, really clear, mobilised strategies where they can actually challenge irrational thoughts, right? The trouble with trauma and the trouble with mental ill health is that it didn't get the thought memo. Because the number of clients who come to me and say, I don't have any thoughts. I just went from 0 to 1,000, right? So the minute people can actually have, we'll call it insight, so the minute people can actually hear the thoughts, that's actually massive progress, because the minute you can actually hear the thoughts, then you can challenge them, right? So then you develop insight around the boof, if that makes sense. The second bit I actually get people to do is often the reactivity comes in when you have a flight or fight physical response. So I hit up the physical thing where I get people to breathe and retrain or whatever. Often what happens is people are kind of up here and we train them to the point that they're back down to normal. It's just literally breathing, retraining their body, right? The final one that we do is the behavioural response, which is essentially, I call it softening your reactions to things. So there's no normal anymore when you've, say, had a death of a child. There's no normal. Getting back to normal is not the goal, right? The goal, and anyone that tells you that has to hand in their bloody therapist card, right? The goal is to soften your reactions to things, soften your reactions to triggers. Now, what that starts with is that people avoid behaviours and particularly feelings that overwhelm them. So I'll give you a good example. I had a client, got to be careful with the sort of things I say because they're identifying, but, you know, pretty massive trauma and a death of a child, and she was coping too well, right? And everyone's going, oh my God, she's coping so well, and all that sort of stuff. And I said, do you cry much? She said, not really. And this was 3 months after her child was murdered, right? That's not normal, right? The things that we fear, we avoid. The more we avoid, the worse they get, right? So I said to her, okay, your homework is to find 15 minutes a day where no one can interrupt you, and I want you to cry your frigging heart out. right? And that's all we did, just safe place, 15 minutes a day. What actually happens then is that when you're actually crying, you're processing traumatic salient aspects of the actual trauma itself, right? And so it's more than just crying, right? It's actually getting people to feel what they need to feel. So some of it might be anger as well. So some of my clients will say, look, I avoid anger because if I'm angry at this, it'll be like a tsunami will go off and I won't be able to control myself. So I had a client who, her goal was anger, right? And anger's an interesting emotion because it's a high energy state. Now, anger gives us a rest from vulnerability, right? So it's a really great thing to say to my clients. Anger gives you a rest from vulnerability. You want to visit anger, you don't want to live there. You need to feel what you need to feel. And so one of my clients, and she was one of those people that just couldn't feel the anger that she needed to feel. And it was first Mother's Day without her child. Every bloody right to feel angry. And she rang me and she said, oh, you'd be so proud of me. And I said, why is that? She goes, I was bloody angry. And I said, oh, cool, what happened? She goes, I woke up and I was throwing the cushion around. And then my sister came out and she was throwing shit around. And I said, how long did that go on for? She goes, oh, about an hour. And I said, how'd you feel? She goes, bloody awesome. See what I mean?
And just on that, to go back to the idea of love.
Yes.
Because I want you to read something else to us, to share the story of the man who could not love, or could not, to make it even more specific, receive love.
Very different, receiving and showing, very
receiving
different.
and showing love. Would you read a little bit of that for us?
I will. Yeah. It's actually interesting too, because as psychologists, we quite often miss love because we think it's a positive emotion. And when people come from extraordinary abuse, it's not. It feels, deep self-loathing, I guess. This is actually a really interesting one because, I'll be honest with you, it's the easiest work I've ever done as a therapist, hey? I deal with really complex clients and this was the simplest work I've ever done in my life. And it is interesting in the book. I asked people, what's your favourite case study of the whole book? And every single person says this. So I hope you enjoy this one. It was Carl Jung who said that what you resist persists. When we deny, we cannot grow. The therapist's job is to help our clients develop insight because that's when change begins. As humans, there is comfort in what is hardwired and predictable. For survivors, that hardwiring means being in denial because surviving abuse requires it. However, healing from it doesn't. Recovery from trauma from abuse is about relationships. I was doing a workshop with a women's group in a remote area, just a short one on sexual abuse, indicators, signs, what to do, disclosures, etc. Once the workshop had finished, a beautiful older gentleman came into the room. I was chatting to a lot of women about their personal issues and concerns. The man's presentation told me straight away that he had a story to tell. He was stooped over, just staring at the ground in front of him. He was a fit, charismatic-looking man with a cowboy hat on. His rough hands seemed as if they'd seen many years of hard work, and his eyes told me so much. They held so much pain. When I eventually got to him after the women had left, and we were talking about a good long hour here, he just burst into tears. It took a while for him to speak, and I just gave him the space and reassured him, saying, it's all right, I'm with you. After a while, he said, that stuff you were talking about, the sexual abuse, he said, that happened to me. A pause. And you're the first person I've told. This is what I mean about the need for people to disclose to someone and the fear of doing it. Here was a man who was probably in his 70s and he'd held this for his entire life. So can I ask why today? I said, what's led you to get something out that you have buried for so long? Well, I've just had my first grandchild. Okay, and what's that meant for you? His face was etched with pain when he looked up at me. Well, I can't hug her. Why not? Because I've heard that if you were sexually abused, you'll become a sex offender as well. That's what the men who abused me told me. That's what I've heard people say. There is significant shame in being a victim, and that's what perpetrators rely on to keep their victims silent. I told him gently, I need you to hear this. There is no evidence that the abused automatically becomes an abuser in every instance. If that were the case, then logically more women would be sex offenders because significantly more women are victims. Obviously, sex offenders don't come from Brady Bunch families and there's some type of abuse in their background, but there's also evidence that nature is just as important. The most consistent variable is the normalisation of criminality in their background, but there are also genetic and biological contributors. Because I'd spent a bit of time during my master's placement working with sex offenders, I was also fairly efficient at assessing attraction to children, although I knew that this was unlikely to be the case for this man, based purely on his insight that manifested as severe behavioural control. I did this basic checking anyway. As we chatted, he talked about his 5 children, who he had raised to be exceptional people. Him and his wife had a wonderful marriage, and as he spoke, I was struck by how is it possible for people who come from such extraordinary trauma to build a loving family. There can be such resilience in those who are able to believe in and create love, safety and goodness despite what they've experienced. However, because trauma like this can manifest so variously, the other kids who lived in the mission with this beautiful man have all processed it differently, and that's because trauma is as generalised as it is individual. We all have our own unique stress response mechanisms, which are a byproduct of genetics, biology and environment. And we know that up to 20% of post-traumatic stress disorder is a genetic contribution, and there is a biological contribution which has been the focus of research. We do understand that trauma can have a biological impact on a person's genes, which can then be passed into future generations, and this can alter genetic expression. In simple terms, epigenetics is the study of biological control mechanisms of DNA, which turns genes on or off, or change how genes are expressed. Epigenetics potentially explains why trauma effects may endure long after the immediate threat is gone, and it is also implicated in the many pathways by which trauma is transmitted to future generations. Studies have shown that children of Holocaust survivors with post-traumatic stress disorder tended to have low cortisol levels, which is linked to vulnerability to PTSD, even if they did not have PTSD themselves. Of course, how traumatised parents interact with their children also influence their development. So for this gentleman, receiving love felt intolerable, more so than showing love. He described hugging someone he loved as feeling like he was going to vomit, and it would become so intolerable that he had to stop hugging them immediately. It is common that intolerance for love shows up as a visceral reaction, and pushing people away means that you've tapped out of your tolerance for it. But at its core, it is a self-protection mechanism learnt from the pain of attaching. I'm going to reject you before you reject or hurt me. Mostly he managed it by avoidance, and his kids learnt long ago never to reach for a hug from their dad. So how do you fix it? Well, you get people to develop tolerance for the emotions they do not tolerate well. Why? Because securely attached people tolerate the entire range of emotions, both positive and negative, and it's irrefutable that secure attachment has significant links with good mental health outcomes. The trick is to identify which emotion or emotions the individual does not tolerate. This is the tough part of therapeutic assessment and then interventions. And many therapists, sadly, do not understand attachment theory at this complex level required very well. The training is basic, but not how it applies in complex trauma. Knowing how to translate this with Aboriginal clients when there is no guiding foundational research becomes impossible for most therapists without putting enormous effort into professional development and then becoming comfortable with Aboriginal clients who have been exposed to extraordinary trauma. This is another reason intergenerational trauma is so entrenched, a failure of the profession to skill practitioners to the cultural and clinical depth required. Some clinicians also fail to understand that testing attachment cannot be done theoretically or without human interaction, because that is what tests attachment tolerance. With Aboriginal people, it's critical that everything is done in real life. Everything must be concrete. The technical term for this is in vivo. You cannot determine if attachment tolerance is improving without testing it through human interaction. So once we'd gone through all the talking and testing, it was clear that love was this man's most intolerable emotion, and it was tied in with self-loathing, shame and guilt, and all the other emotions that victims of abuse experience. The field of neuroplasticity is an exciting area that helps with so much of this. We know that trauma, which can include grief, has an impact on the amygdala, the area that controls emotions and the ability to regulate and tolerate them. This is at the executive level, functioning within the emotional centre of your brain. Neuroplasticity shows us that after 6 weeks of exposure-based therapies, the brain goes back to normal. It heals itself. So I asked this man, when was the last time you hugged your daughter? He looked up at me with terror on his face, like I just asked him to give me his cowboy hat. Never, he said. Okay, you said she works at the local store? He nodded. Let's go. We're going to go and hug your daughter. At this point, he became like a paralysed cat. I eventually got him into the car, and as fate would have it, as we arrived at the store, out walked his daughter. I knew this because his face lit up when he saw her. I said, "Is that your daughter? Because she looks like you." He almost didn't want to admit it, but with a soft voice said yes. I said, "All right, get out. We're going to go and hug her." We got out of the car and approached this beautiful young woman, and I said, "Hi, I'm Tracy. I got your dad here and he's going to hug you." She looked at me like she was thinking, "Who the hell are you?" As I gave the instructions to the man who couldn't love, which I began to call him, he very awkwardly hugged his daughter, and frankly, it was like watching someone hug a wine barrel. It was pathetic. So I said to him, "Mate, that's the worst hug I've ever seen. Do it again." As the daughter started laughing, I said to her, now your job, beautiful lady, is to make sure that your dad practices hugging you twice a day, first thing in the morning, last thing at night. But he has to extend the amount of time he hugs you for 10 seconds each time. Can you do that for me? She nodded, laughing through the tears. And your job, Mr. Man who cannot love... God, I'm bossy, aren't I? I'm so bloody bossy. I didn't realise how bossy I was. And your job, Mr. Man who cannot love, is to force yourself to hug your daughter until you've extended that time, even if you have to count in your head until you hit that goal. A few weeks later, I get a phone call. It was from the man who couldn't love. And all I can hear in the background was the sound of a gurgly little baby, you know, the lovely giggling sound that only a child can make, which fills your heart with joy. And he said to me, guess what? And I said, what? I've got my granddaughter on my lap. Yeah, I can hear that little giggling sound in the background. He said, I've had her on my lap for 2 hours and I can't stop hugging her. And I said, mate, you have a lifetime of hugs to make up for. You hug the hell out of that kid. It's the thing about attachment, you can address it at any time. Once you learn how to show love, you can pass it on to your kids. They can then pass it on to their kids, and what a wonderful legacy that is. And when that beautiful man rang me again a few days later and he said, you know what, I didn't think I could fix this about myself just by practicing. It's possible for change to occur at any time. We just need to trust that it's possible.
What a beautiful story. We started with love and we finished there with love, and I'd love for you to ask your questions as well. So if you have any questions for Tracy, we have microphones here and also up the back there for people. If you could make your way to those microphones. While you do, I just wanted to ask one more thing before we go to the audience questions, Tracy, and that is, you've spoken about, you know, the trauma we have to overcome, the things we have to deal with. But what about when you are successful? Because we're not used to it.
No.
And other people are not used to us being successful. I remember once someone on radio, well-known media person actually, which probably isn't saying much, but she said, oh, Stan Grant, I mean, he goes on about being Aboriginal. I mean, really, he drives a BMW and lives at the beach. How Aboriginal can he be? Seriously,
yeah,
I mean, but for us as well, I had a really weird experience when I completed my PhD and I didn't want to go to the graduation ceremony. I've never been able to do those things, to do the public acknowledgement of success. And I said, just mail it to me. And when I opened it, the certificate's a beautiful thing, but I loved the work that went into it and I appreciate that, but I felt really ashamed. Yeah. I felt like, you know what I thought? Who do you think you are? Absolutely. That's the first thing that came into my mind. Yep. And I was quite depressed for a couple of days afterwards. I just thought, why? Yeah, who do you think you are? Why does this matter? How do you've spoken about where you've come from and the things you've had to overcome in your family and living with that success and being, I don't know if pride's the right word, but being comfortable with it and acknowledging it and even celebrating it. Yeah. How do you do that?
God, there's so many layers to this, Stan. We could just talk about this all night, but there's so many things in terms of... The first thing I want to say really strongly here is that if you are sharing space but not sharing power, it's tokenism, right? So what happens with systems is that it's within their... if they like to share space with it but not power. So there's not enough imagination in the world that an Indigenous woman from the Pilbara could possibly be the best in Australia at something or the best in the world at something, right? There's not enough imagination in the world for that. And so same with you. So what they have to do is they have to de-Aboriginal us, right? So they have to fit us into a comfortable box. So when I got a PhD, I wasn't a grassroots Aboriginal anymore. Right? So they like to de-Aboriginal us or de-black us, I call it. So it happens a lot with my students as well. And so what you have to do, again, it comes down to that strength of identity again. But we have absolutely, I feel ashamed of the success. For a long time, I felt ashamed of my success. I hid the success. And then you sort of sit there and you go, okay, so if every single person around the table is funded by government, because I've never had government funding, then who's holding the government to account, right? And so people like you and I, like self-determined, financially successful, we should be celebrated because we've busted through every single barrier to get to where we are. None of us have inherited generational wealth. None of us have inherited generational, educational advantage. And don't you love Michelle Obama's thing, which she said in the Democratic Convention recently, the affirmative action of generational wealth. Isn't that a great, comment, right?
Yeah.
That why aren't we talking about that sort of stuff, that the people who have actually busted through more barriers than anyone else, like us, should actually be applauded and celebrated, but instead we're actually then, get attacks that we're not real Aboriginals, or we've sold our culture out, or whatever happens. My students experience this a lot as well. So they go through a similar thing, and I actually have this thing that I say to all of them, my students. I say, I'm going to let you out of your suspense right now. You are never, ever, ever going to be the right type of Aboriginal. I'm going to let you out of your suspense right now for haters. But you know who doesn't care about that? The thousands and thousands of Indigenous people in critical mental health distress that you're going to help during your clinical lifetime. They don't give a rat's ass about what kind of Aboriginal you are.
Fantastic.
So, yeah.
We could raise the house lights. We could go. Some people are ready to, if you have any questions at all, I think you can see
there's a lot
the
of people.
microphones here. There's a lot of people. But please make your way to those microphones. If anyone has, please, if there's anything you want to ask Tracy at all. Hey, Joe.
Tracy, can we get your opinion on, there's the latest commentary around in the news and stuff around raise the age.
Yeah, definitely.
The stuff around brain development with young people and how it takes so many years for a brain to develop, and then we're locking up kids that clearly, are going through challenges around brain development as well.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's something I've been a real passionate advocate. How you going, Joe? Good to see you. Good to see you, mate. Yeah, but this is like a reunion.
It's family reunion for me.
You know that stereotype all Aboriginals know each other? It's actually not a stereotype. We're
actually all related to each other.
That's right, we're actually all related and know each other. Look, I've been a real passionate advocate for raise the age, basically because the evidence tells us that the earlier you incarcerate children, that's the strongest predictor of future criminality, is the earlier you actually put a kid in prison. That virtually assures that future pathway. So the stats, 98% of kids that go to prison will go back to prison before they turn 18, right? So this is what happens in terms of, people don't actually understand it from a position of moral development. So people say kids know the difference between right and wrong and blah, 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 and all these sorts of things. Now, this is what happens when kids, there's two things to it. The first thing that happens when kids develop a sense of internal, people who are parents in the room actually understand that your job is to get your kids to develop a sense of internal moral reasoning without you having to explain it to them, explain right and wrong to them. And that takes quite a long time for kids to develop that ability to do that, to weigh up moral reasoning. Now, what actually happens, kids around about 10 to 13, and we have a range because obviously kids develop at different stages. There's a really interesting stage of moral development that they're going through, and that is that they hate being in trouble. Now, this sounds like it should be a good thing, that kids hate being in trouble. Now, the problem is if you put kids in prison at that stage of moral development where they hate being in trouble, you run the very strong risk of that stage of moral reasoning and development being stagnated or permanent, which means that they learn to tell better lies, they learn to avoid law enforcement better and all those sorts of things. The next bit that's much more important is attachment matters. Okay, so how we develop a sense of ourselves as loved and lovable, and certainly I've worked with people who have done some pretty horrific things. Right. I do risk assessment on people to figure out predicting likelihood of future criminality, as an example. What I'm actually looking at is people's internal motivation to change. And often what I find with people is they're, in terms of psychologically motivated to change, they'll always talk to relationships. I want to be a better father, I want to be a better mother, so I want to change so that I can be a better person. And so attachment matters. If you put a kid in prison at 10, 12, 13, you teach them from a very young age not to rely on anyone to predictably love and support you anymore, which means that attachments don't matter, actually. So if you're dealing with someone, so after a while, these kids literally have nothing to lose, and they can keep spending time in prison again and again and again and again and again, and it doesn't matter at all. Attachments matter, right? So there's all those sorts of things in terms of, we know, look, 25 years as a psychologist, I've yet to see a kid come out of prison psychologically and emotionally in terms of contribution to society better off as a direct result of that prison sentence. Yeah, but I've seen many people change as a result of dealing with the things that got them there in the first place. Right. But 10, kids are so unrehabilitatable that we have to put them in prison. We also need to understand, the statistics tell us this, 87% of kids in prison are on remand, which means that they haven't been convicted of a crime. Now, it gets worse. We actually don't know what kids are doing in prison. Now, have a look at the youth crime data and be really clear about I pay attention to how things are worded. The wording is crimes proceeded against by police. They're not convictions. That's a policeman going, hey, Stan, you did this, right? Now, that's a long way to actually being convicted of a crime. So it's actually called crimes proceeded against by police. Now, when those children eventually get in front of a magistrate, 50% of those are deemed to be innocent of a crime. We now know, the data coming from Queensland says that 70% of kids who are in prison are copping to crimes they know they didn't commit to get out of prison. The average Aboriginal kid spends 71 days in prison without conviction, right? This is a human rights issue, Stan, that is just... We're a first world country. Surely we can do better than this, you know? This is... thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Tracy asked me to write something for this book, and I was so honoured just to write a little line. And I said, read this and be better. And I think tonight, after hearing Tracy, we know how to be better. Please thank Tracy Westerman. And thank you all for coming along.
Please thank Stan Grant as well.